All right, we are about to read chapter 10 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This will not be a typical audiobook reading. This is for people who want to learn and practice English. So, as we read, we will clarify or talk about the things that are being said in a very plain way so that people who are learning English can understand. And when we find useful vocabulary, we will spend some time talking about that vocabulary. Now, I'm doing this live, so if you're watching with me, then and you have a question and I didn't explain something, then please leave a comment in the chat. And if I see it, I will be happy to explain whatever question that you have. Okay. Now, chapter 10, in chapter 9, Davy had to go home from school. He was called home from school because his mother died, and he had to attend the funeral of his mother. And now he's an orphan. He has his stepfather who hates him, and the stepfather's sister who also hates him. And the funeral just finished. His mother's funeral just finished in chapter 9. So the title of chapter 10 is I Become Neglected and I Am Provided For. That's kind of a contradiction. Do you know the word neglect? Neglect means ignored in a bad way. When you neglect something, you're ignoring something that you're supposed to take care of. Now Davy's parents are dead, and the only person who will take care of him is his stepfather. From this title, we can guess that his stepfather isn't going to take care of him. But then the contradiction comes with, I am provided for. Because what provided for means, especially in this case, a little boy with no parents, somebody is paying money for him. Somebody is paying money so that he can eat or he has a place to stay. That's providing for someone. So the title of chapter 10 is I become neglected and am provided for, which is a contradiction because it says they're ignoring me and not taking care of me. They're supposed to. And then it says I'm provided for, meaning somebody is taking care of me. Let's see what that means. The first act of business Miss Murdstone performed when the day of solemnity was over. Now, Miss Murdstone is his father-in-law's evil sister. And solemnity means seriousness. So the first thing his stepfather's evil sister did with the day of the mother's funeral, the day of solemnity, the day of seriousness, was over. And light was freely admitted into the house. So maybe during the funeral, they closed the curtains and didn't let light come into the house. So now they've opened the curtains again. And now light is coming into the house. Was to give Peggotty a month's warning. Much as Peggotty would have disliked such service, I believe she would have retained it for my sake. So the first thing they did was fire the maid, Peggotty, who actually was more like a family member to Davy and his mother. And Davy is saying that Peggotty hates them, but she probably would have stayed if they didn't fire her. She told me we must part. That means she told me we must go different ways. And told me why. And we condoled with one another in all sincerity. So they were saying goodbye and how sorry they were to be leaving each other. As to me or my future, not a word was said or a step taken. Happy they would have been, I dare say, if they could have dismissed me at a month's warning too. So Davy is saying, Probably the stepfather wishes that he could fire Davy, just like he fired the maid and told the maid, go. But they can't do that because the stepfather has a legal responsibility for Davy. I mustered courage once again. We've actually talked about this word muster before. I think I made a video with an exercise practicing this word. And muster means to find the energy. What kind of energy did Davy find here? Let's see. I mustered courage. So he found the courage inside. He was afraid, but he found the courage. He mustered courage to ask Miss Murdstone when I was going to be back to school. So Davy left school to go to the funeral. He's at home. And now he's asking the evil sister, when can I go back to school? He thinks he's returning to school. She answered dryly. She believed I was not going back at all. I was told nothing more. I was very anxious to know what was going to be done with me, and so was Peggotty. But neither she nor I could pick up any information on the subject. So now Davy is thinking, I'm not going back to school? Where am I going? They're obviously not going to keep him at the home. They hate him. There was a change in my condition, which, while it relieved me of a great deal of present uneasiness, might have made me, if I had been capable of considering it closely, yet more uncomfortable about the future. It was this. The constraint that had been put upon me was quite abandoned. I was so far from being required to keep my dull post in the parlor that on several occasions, when I took my seat there, Miss Murdstone frowned to me to go away. Now earlier, when Davy was at home, because the Murdstones hate him, his stepfather hates him, his evil sister, the stepfather's evil sister hates him. So Davy used to stay in his room because he felt more comfortable there. But the stepfather insisted, no, you must be down here with us. And so they used to force him to sit there and not talk to him. He would sit there and they would ignore him, or they would say bad things to him. They would abuse him. But now, after his mother died, suddenly they don't care anymore. And actually, they don't want him in that room because he went down there and the stepfather's evil sister went, she didn't like it. She didn't want him there. They hated him. But now it was okay not to pretend anymore. They didn't have to pretend to be nice to him. I was so far from being warned off from Peggotty's society that provided I was not in Mr. Murdstone's, I was never sought out or inquired for. At first, I was in daily dread of his taking my education in hand again, or of Miss Murdstone's devoting herself to it. But I soon began to think that such fears were groundless, and that all I had to anticipate was neglect. Remember, neglect means ignore. They're supposed to be taking care of him, but they're ignoring him, which to him feels good, because when they do pay attention to him, it's really bad. That's never good. I do not conceive that this discovery gave me much pain then. I was still giddy with the shock of my mother's death, and in a kind of stunned state. Stunned means like shocked. So he was still feeling the shock of his mother's death to really think about what was happening in his life. I was in a kind of stunned state as to all of the tributary things. I can recollect, indeed, to have speculated at odd times on the possibility of my not being taught anymore. So now he's worried, I'm not going to school anymore? Or cared for anymore. Nobody's going to take care of me. Nobody's going to feed me. Nobody's going to give me a home. Or growing up to be a shabby, moody man. So he's afraid that because of this neglect of the Murdstones, he won't go to school and he will be shabby, which means poor or dirty or not in good condition. And moody means unhappy. In this case, I think it means unhappy. So he's thinking, they're not going to send me back to school and they're not going to take care of me. I'll be homeless and dirty. And when I grow up to be a man, I'll be a very unpleasant man. Lounging an idle life away about the village. We've seen this word idle before, which means doing nothing when you're supposed to be doing something. Sitting when you're supposed to be walking, something like that. So an idle person is a person doing nothing. So he said, lounging an idle life. Lounging means like relaxing, doing nothing. Maybe he's enjoying this idea. Lounging an idle life, relaxing and doing nothing in the village. As well as on the feasibility of my getting rid of this picture by going away somewhere, like the hero in a story, to seek my fortune. But these were transient visions, daydreams I sat looking at sometimes as if they were faintly painted or written on the wall of my room, and which, as they melted away, left the wall blank again. So he was saying that, well, they were just fantasies. Peggotty, I said in a thoughtful whisper one evening when I was warming my hands at the kitchen fire, Mr. Murdstone likes me less than he used to. He never liked me much, Peggotty, but he would rather not even see me now if he can help it. So Davy's noticed, he's telling Peggotty, they don't even talk to me anymore. Peggotty says, perhaps it's his sorrow, stroking my hair. I'm pretty sure, Peggotty. I'm sorry, too, if I believed it was his sorrow. I should not think of it at all. But it's not that. Oh, no, it's not that. So Peggotty is saying, well, maybe he's just sad because your mother just died. His wife just died. And Davy says, if that were true, if that were the reason, then it wouldn't bother me. But that's not the reason. That's definitely not the reason. And Peggotty says, how do you know that it's not? How do you know that it's not that? After a silence. Oh, his sorrow is another and quite a different thing. He is sorry at this moment, sitting by the fireside with Miss Murdstone. But if I was to go in, Peggotty, he would be something besides. So Davy is saying, yes, right now, if you go and see him in the parlor, he looks sad. But if I walk into the room, that is not sadness. That is something else, like hatred. What would he be? Said Peggotty. Angry, I answered, in an involuntary imitation of his dark frown. That's a frown. A frown is the opposite of a smile. If he was only sorry, he wouldn't look at me as he does. I'm only sorry, and it makes me feel kinder. So Davy, who's just a little boy, is noticing that when you're sorry about something, when you feel bad about something, you usually are nicer. But he's not nicer, he's angrier. He's very angry. Davy, she said at length. Yes, Peggotty. I've tried, my dear, all ways I could think of, all the ways there are, and all the ways there ain't, in short, to get a suitable service here in Blunderstone. But there's no such a thing, my love. So Peggotty has 1 month to find another job, and she wants to stay in the village so that she can look after Davy, so that she can see him. But there's no work available. And what do you mean to do, Peggotty? Says I, wistfully. Do you mean to go back and seek your fortune? Seeking your fortune... Well, let's see. Let me see how she answers this question. I expect I shall be forced to go to Yarmouth, replied Peggotty, and live there. Seeking your fortune, that sounds like something a little boy imagines an adult does. You know, going on an adventure and, I don't know, becoming a pirate or becoming a king or something like that. So Davy says, "Are you going to seek your fortune, Peggotty?" And she says, "No, I'll have to go back to Yarmouth, where her brother lives." "You might have gone farther off," I said, brightening a little, "and been as bad as lost. I shall see you sometimes, dear old Peggotty there. You won't be quite at another end of the world, will you?" "Contrary ways please God," cried Peggotty with great animation. "As long as you are here, my pet, I shall come over every week of my life to see you, one day every week of my life." So Davy's saying, well, Yarmouth isn't really that far, so we can still see each other. And Peggotty says, "I will come once a week." "I'm a-going, Davy, you see, to my brother's. First, for another fortnight's visit. A fortnight is 14 nights. 2 weeks. Just till I've had time to look about me and get to be something like myself again. Now I've been thinking that perhaps, as they don't want you here at present, you might be going along with me." So Peggotty is going to Yarmouth to stay with her brother, and she's going to try to take Davy with her. "If anything, short of being in a different relation to everyone about me," Peggotty accepted, could have given me a sense of pleasure at the time, it would have been this project of all others, the idea again of being surrounded by those honest faces, shining welcome on me, of renewing peacefulness, of the sweet Sunday morning, when the bells were ringing, the stones dropping in the water, and the shadowy ships breaking through the mist, of roaming up and down with little Emily, telling her my troubles, and finding charms against them in the shells and pebbles on the beach, made a calm in my heart. It was ruffled next moment, to be sure, by a doubt of Miss Murdstone's giving her consent. So Davy is thinking that would be a wonderful place to be, with Peggotty and her brother and all of the people who live with her brother, and he was imagining how fun that would be to be with them. But all of that dream stopped the minute he thought, oh, Miss Murdstone would never say yes to that. But even that was set at rest soon, for she came out to take an evening grope in the store closet while we were yet in conversation, and Peggotty, with a boldness that amazed me, broached this topic on the spot. So as they were talking about it, Miss Murdstone came into the kitchen to look for something, and Peggotty, this was very shocking and very surprising to Davy, but Peggotty just directly asked her. She probably didn't care anymore because she was fired, so she could say or do whatever she wanted. "The boy will idle there," said Miss Murdstone. Remember, idle means do nothing. So she's saying, if he goes with you to Yarmouth, he'll just do nothing there, and that's no good. The boy will be idle there," said Miss Murdstone, looking into a pickle jar. "And idleness is the root of all evil. But to be sure, he would be idle here or anywhere, in my opinion." So she says, if he goes with you to Yarmouth, he'll do nothing. He'll be idle. And then she says, but he would probably be idle here too, or anywhere, because he's lazy and no good. Peggotty had an angry answer ready, I could see, but she swallowed it for my sake and remained silent. Said Miss Murdstone, still keeping her eye on the pickles. "It is of more importance than anything else, if it is of paramount importance, that my brother should not be disturbed or made uncomfortable. I suppose I had better say yes. So she agrees to it because she doesn't want to bother her brother with the question. I thanked her without making any demonstration of joy, lest it should induce her to withdraw her assent. So he said thank you, but in a very polite, calm way, because if he had been too enthusiastic, she might have seen that happiness and wanted to take it away from him by changing her mind. Nor could I help thinking this as a prudent course, since she looked at me out of the pickle jar with as great an access of sourness as her black eyes had absorbed its contents. So she was looking at pickle jars, but Davy could see through the pickle jar that look of hate on her face. She really hated him. However, the permission was given and was never retracted, for when the month was out, when the month finished, Peggotty and I were ready to depart. Mr. Barkis came into the house for Peggotty's boxes. I had never known him to pass the garden gate before, but on this occasion he came into the house, and he gave me a look as he shouldered, meaning putting the box on her shoulder, as he shouldered the largest box and went out, which I thought had meaning in it. Which I thought had meaning in it. If meaning could ever be said to find its way into Mr. Barkis's visage. Barkis doesn't really talk very much, so Davy interpreted this extra favor of going into the house and picking up Peggotty's boxes and carrying them to the cart as that means something. That has a significance. Peggotty was naturally in low spirits. I think we've talked about this phrase to be out of spirits, which means to be in a bad mood. And now we have it again a little bit differently. Peggotty was in low spirits. That means that she wasn't very happy. She was sad. Peggotty was naturally in low spirits, leaving what had been near her home so many years. So that was like her home. She lived there for many years, and she was sad to leave it. And where the two strong attachments of her life, for my mother and myself, had been formed, she had been walking in the churchyard, too, very early. She got into the cart and sat in it with her handkerchief to her eyes. So a handkerchief, well, let me show you a picture of a handkerchief in case you don't know. People don't use them very much anymore. You can still get them. Whoops. Men still use them in suits, and they call them pocket squares. But really, oh wait, where did it go? What's going on here? Okay. Wait a minute. Why isn't this showing up? Wait, let me try. Okay, here's. So a handkerchief, they call them, men still put them in their, if they wear a suit, they might still put them in their suit, but then they call it a pocket square. But the original use of the handkerchief is to, wipe your head or wipe your nose or something like that. You can see before ladies used to carry them in their hands all the time. But also men. It's not a female thing. Everybody used handkerchiefs at one point. All right. Wait a minute. Hold on. Oh no. All right. I'm lost here. Give me a second. What happened? Here we go. So let me reread that sentence. And she got into the cart, and she sat with her handkerchief at her eyes. So she was probably crying or about to cry, and that's why she had the handkerchief there. So long as she remained in this condition, Mr. Barkis gave no sign of life whatever. So she was very sad, and Mr. Barkis, who's in love with her, didn't say or try to do anything. He just minded his own business. He sat in his usual place and attitude like a great stuffed figure. But when she began to look about her and to speak to me, so Peggotty was very sad and she had the handkerchief in her eyes and she was in her own world. And then it says, when she began to look about her, which means she's noticing the world around her. So she came out of her sadness for a minute. So when she began to look about her and speak to me, then she started speaking to Davy. He nodded his head and grinned several times. I have not the least notion at whom or what he meant by it. So he nodded his head and he was grinning when she started talking. But Davy was thinking, why is he doing that? Grinning is smiling, and this is nodding your head. But Davy couldn't understand why he was doing that. It's a beautiful day, Mr. Barkis, I said, as an act of politeness. It ain't bad, said Mr. Barkis, who generally qualified his speech and rarely committed himself. Peggotty is quite comfortable now, Mr. Barkis, I remarked for his satisfaction. Is she, though? Said Mr. Barkis. After reflecting about it, with a sagacious air, Mr. Barkis eyed her and said, Are you pretty comfortable? Wait, let's look up that word, sagacious. That's not really a word that you'd ever really use, but I'm not even sure what it means, sagacious. Having shown keen mental discernment or good judgment, shrewd. Okay, let's see how they used it again, sagacious. After reflecting about it with a sagacious air, so Davy says Peggotty is quite comfortable, and Barkis says, is she though? And then he thinks about it, and then he looks at Peggotty and he says, are you comfortable? So it just means that you could see he was thinking about it. He was considering it. Peggotty laughed and answered in the affirmative, so she said yes. But really and truly, you know, are you? Growled Mr. Barkis, sliding near to her on the seat and nudging her. Are you? He's flirting with her. Are you comfortable? Huh? Are you comfortable? I can't believe that. Okay. Let's see. Are you? Really and truly? Are you pretty comfortable? Are you? Okay. At each of these inquiries, Mr. Barkis shuffled near her. So he's getting closer and closer to her as he's doing that. And gave her another nudge. This is a nudge. It's a little nudge. So at last we were all crowded together on the left hand of the cart, and I was squeezed that I could hardly bear it. Peggotty, calling his attention to my sufferings, she said, "Hey, you're squeezing the boy. You're squishing the boy." Mr. Barkis gave me a little more room at once, and got away by degrees. But I could not help observing that he seemed to think he had hit upon a wonderful expedient for expressing himself in a neat, agreeable, and pointed manner without the inconvenience of inventing conversation. So Mr. Barkis, who's in love with Peggotty, is a very quiet man. He doesn't talk very much. He just drives his cart. And now he's kind of discovered a way to flirt with Peggotty. That means show how much he likes her without talking, because he doesn't talk much. He's not a person who talks very much. So now he seems very happy. He's found this way to reach her, to contact her without using words. He manifestly chuckled over it for some time. So chuckling is laughing. So he's really happy that he found this way to communicate with Peggotty that doesn't involve talking. And now he's really happy. So he's he's chuckling while he's riding the horse, while he's driving the cart. By the time he turned to Peggotty again and repeating, Are you pretty comfortable though?" bore down upon us as before until the breath was nearly edged out of my body. So he's getting so close and Davy's in the middle that Davy can't even breathe. By and by, he made another descent upon us with the same inquiry. So he did it again. And the same result. At length, I got up whenever I saw him coming and standing on the footboard, pretending to look at the prospect, after which I did very well. So after Davy realized he was going to continue doing this, when he saw it about to happen, he would stand up and pretend to look at something so that he wouldn't get squeezed in between Peggotty and Mr. Barkis, who are both fat. They're both big fat people. He was so polite as to stop at the public house, expressly on our account, and entertain us with broiled mutton and bear. Even when Peggotty was in the act of drinking, he was seized with one of those approaches and almost choked her. So it seems like he invited them for lunch. They stopped at a public house, and they bought mutton, which is lamb, and beer. And so they were eating and drinking. And even during this time, he did one of those, Are you comfortable? And he says, almost choked her. But as we draw nearer to the end of our journey, as we drew nearer, draw as writing, making a picture, but draw also means to move into a certain direction. So to draw near to a place means kind of to move to a place. And it says, as we drew near to the end of our journey, as we came closer to the end of our journey, he had more to do and less time for gallantry. So gallantry would mean, in this case, showing his respect and love for Peggotty in a special way. Acting manly for her, something like that. And when we got on Yarmouth pavement, we were all too much shaken and jolted, I apprehend, to have any leisure for anything else. Mr. Peggotty and Ham waited for us at the old place. They received me and Peggotty in an affectionate manner, and shook hands with Mr. Barkis, who, with his hat on with his hat on the very back of his head, and a shamefaced leer upon his countenance, so suddenly in the presence of Peggotty's brother, he's a little bit more shy and embarrassed about his behavior. And pervading his very legs presented but a vacant appearance, I thought. They each took one of Peggotty's trunks, and we were going away when Mr. Barkis solemnly, remember that word solemn means serious. Mr. Barkis solemnly made a sign to me with his forefinger to come under the archway. So Mr. Barkis went to Davy, very serious, come here. I say, growled Mr. Barkis, it was all right? I looked upon his face and answered with an attempt to be very profound. Oh? It didn't come to an end there, said Mr. Barkis, nodding confidently. It was all right. Again I answered, oh? You know, who was willin', said my friend. It was Barkis, and Barkis only. I nodded in assent. It's all right, said Mr. Barkis, shaking hands. I'm a friend of yourn. You made it all right. First, it's all right. Now, this is hard for me to understand. Uh, Earlier, because Barkis is the driver who always takes Davy to town to go to school. So he's traveled with Barkis many times. And in an earlier chapter, he wanted Davy to pass a message to Peggotty. And the message was, remember, Barkis doesn't really talk very much. So the message was, Barkis is willing. Barkis is willing. And willing means, I mean, you know the word will for the future, but will can also, in English, mean to want to do something, to have the desire to do something. So this message, Barkis is willing, means Barkis wants to marry Peggotty. And Davy took the answer to Peggotty. He told her, Davy took the message to Peggotty, and he told her, Barkis told me to tell you he's willing. I don't remember if she answered. I can't remember now if she answered. But now he's asking about it. He's saying, it's all right, it's okay. I think that's what's happening. But, you know, the way he talks, it's hard to understand. In his attempts to be particularly lucid, Mr. Barkis was so extremely mysterious, so even Davy is saying he's being mysterious, I don't understand, that I might have stood looking in his face for an hour, and most assuredly should have got as much information out of it as out of the face of a clock that had stopped, but for Peggotty's calling me away. As we were going along, she asked me what he had said, and I told her. He had said it was all right. Like his impudence, said Peggotty, but I don't mind that, dear Davy. What should you think if I was to think of being married? So Peggotty's thinking about marrying Barkis. Why, I suppose you would like me as much as then. Wait, let me read that again. Why, I suppose you would like me as much then. Oh, so Davy is saying, I don't care as long as you still love me. Peggotty, why, I suppose you would like me as much then, Peggotty, as you do now. I returned after a little consideration. Greatly to the astonishment of the passengers in the street, as well as her relations going on before, the good soul was obliged to stop and embrace me on the spot. So Peggotty says, what do you think, Davy, if I got married to Mr. Barkis? And Davy answers, well, I don't care because you still love me the same, right? And that made her cry. So she, in the middle of the street, she went down to the street and she gave him a hug for that answer. Let's see. Let's read that line again. So greatly to the astonishment of the passengers in the street, as well as of her relations going on before. So her brother was there and some other people. The good soul was obliged to stop and embrace me on the spot, right there in front of everyone, with many protestations of her unalterable love. Tell me, what should you say, darling? She asked again, when this was over and we were walking on. If you were thinking of being married to Mr. Barkis. Peggotty? Yes, said Peggotty. I should think it would be a very good thing, for then, you know, Peggotty, you would always have the horse and cart to bring you over to see me, and could come for nothing and be sure of coming. So Davy says it's a wonderful idea if you marry Barkis, because he has a horse and a cart, and you can come and see me whenever you want. The sense of the dare, cried Peggotty. What I have been thinking of this month back. Yes, my precious, and I think I should be more independent altogether, you see, let alone my working with a better heart in my own house than I could in anybody else's. So Peggotty was saying, actually, I was thinking the same thing. And I would be more comfortable and do a better job cleaning and doing housework in my own house than working for somebody else. And I shall be always near my pretty's resting place. So she'll always be near the grave of Davy's mother so she can visit it, said Peggotty, musing, and be able to see it when I like, and when I lie down to rest, I may be laid not far off from my darling girl. So she's saying, and when I die, I can be buried near her. We can be together, buried in the ground. We neither of us said anything for a little while. But I wouldn't so much as give it another thought, said Peggotty cheerily, if my Davy was anyways against it. Not if I had been asked in church 30 times, 3 times over, and was wearing out the ring in my pocket. So Peggotty is saying, if Davy, if you don't want me to marry Mr. Barkis, I won't. Look at me, Peggotty, I replied, and see if I'm not really glad, and don't truly wish it, as indeed I did, with all my heart. Well, my life, said Peggotty, giving me a squeeze, I have thought of it night and day, every way I can, and I hope the right way. But I'll think of it again, and speak to my brother about it. And in the meantime, we'll keep it to ourselves, Davy, you and me. So Peggotty's been thinking about this for a long time, marrying Barkis, and she's decided that she will talk to her brother about it and ask him if he thinks it's a good idea. But then she's saying, until I do that, it's our secret. Don't tell anybody about this. Barkis is a good plain creature, said Peggotty, and if I tried to do my duty by him, I think it would be my fault if I wasn't pretty comfortable. So Peggotty is saying he's a simple man, but he would be very good to me, and if I wasn't happy, it would definitely be my fault. Said Peggotty, laughing heartily. This quotation from Mr. Barkis was so appropriate and tickled us both so much that we laughed again and again. Oh, I didn't even notice that joke that she said, if I wasn't pretty comfortable. Remember, Barkis kept flirting with her, saying, are you comfortable? Are you comfortable? So they were laughing about that. It was a joke. Okay, and we laughed again and again, and we were quite in a pleasant humor when we came within view of Mr. Peggotty's cottage. It looked just the same, except that it may perhaps have shrunk a little in my eyes, and Mrs. Gummidge was waiting at the door, as if she had stood there ever since. So they arrive at the house of Peggotty's brother, and Mrs. Gummidge, who stays in the house, was at the door, and it seemed to Davy that she had never left there. So maybe when Davy was leaving, when he spent the summer there a few years ago, maybe when he was leaving, he remembers seeing her in that very spot. And so in his mind, it was like she never left, like she stayed right there in that spot. All was the same, down to the seaweed in the blue mug in my bedroom. I went into the outhouse to look about me, and the very same lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, possessed by the same desires to pinch the world in general, appeared to be in the same state of conglomeration in the same old corner. But there was no little Emily to be seen, so I asked Mr. Peggotty where she was. She's at school, sir, said Mr. Peggotty, wiping the heat consequent on the potterage of Peggotty's box from his forehead. So I guess he was sweating, and so he was wiping the sweat from his forehead. She'll be home, looking at the Dutch clock, in from 20 minutes to half an hour's time. So little Emily, that's his little girlfriend that he made while he was staying there, is at school, but she's returning very soon. We all on us feel the loss of her, bless ye, Mrs. Gummidge moaned. Cheer up, mother, cried Mr. Peggotty. I feel it more than anybody else, said Mrs. Gummidge. I'm a lone, lorn creature, and she used to be the almost the only thing that didn't go contrary with me. I don't know who she's talking about. I don't think that she could be talking about Davy's mother. Let's see. Mrs. Gummidge whimpering. Whimpering is like and shaking her head, and whimpering, applied herself to blowing the fire. So there's a fire and she's blowing it. She's giving it more air to make it bigger and stronger. Mr. Peggotty, looking round upon us while she was so engaged, said in a low voice, which he added with his hand, the old un from this I rightly conjectured that no improvement had taken place since my last... Oh, wait, let me reread that. The old un. So he's kind of making fun of her. From this I rightly conjectured that no improvement had taken place since my last visit in the state of Mrs. Gummidge's spirits. So Mrs. Gummidge is a very sad person, and she's always depressed and always focusing on death. Because she lost her husband and I think her son or her brother all to the sea because they were all fishermen. And now she's alone. But she lives with Mr. Peggotty, who lets her live there. If she didn't live there, she would probably live in the streets. But she's a very sad, depressed woman. And she still is, even after all of this time. So the last time, that's how Davy remembers her from his last visit. Now the whole place was, or it should have been, quite as delightful a place as ever. And yet it did not impress me in the same way. I felt rather disappointed with it. Perhaps it was because little Emily was not at home. I knew the way by which she would come, and I presently found myself strolling along the path to meet her. So Davy was really excited to go back to Mr. Peggotty's cottage because he loved it there, and he had really happy memories of that place. But he was surprised when he got there, when he arrived there, that actually it wasn't as wonderful as he remembered it. There was something missing, something that didn't make him happy. And then he thought, maybe it's because Emily is not here. And since he knew which way she would walk home from school, he decided to walk towards the school and hopefully meet her along the way. A figure appeared in the distance before long. I soon knew it to be Emily, who was a little creature still in stature, though she was grown. So Emily is still short, but Davy is saying she's grown, which I guess means that she's maturing, looking more like a woman. But when she drew near, remember, draw near means like come near. When she came near, when she drew near, and I saw her blue eyes looking bluer, and her dimpled face looking brighter. These are dimples, the little indentations here. Her dimpled face looking brighter, and her whole self prettier and gayer. Gayer means happier, so she looked happier. A curious feeling came over me that made me pretend not to know her and pass by as if I were looking at something a long way off. So Davy is pretending not to see her. She's walking this way and Davy's walking this way, and suddenly for some reason he decides to pretend he doesn't recognize her or know her, and he tries to walk past. I've done such a thing since in later life, or I am mistaken. Little Emily didn't care a bit. She saw me well enough, but instead of turning round and calling after me, ran away laughing. This obliged me to run after her. So she saw him and she recognized him, but she didn't care. She kept walking. And that made Davy go and chase her, run after her. We were very near the cottage before I caught her. "Oh, it's you, is it?" said little Emily. So she says, "Oh, it's you. I didn't recognize you." Why, you knew who it was, Emily, said I. And didn't you know who it was? And didn't you know who it was? Said Emily. I was going to kiss her, but she covered her cherry lips with her hands, and she said she wasn't a baby now, and ran away, laughing more than ever, into the house. She seemed to delight in teasing me, which was a change in her I wondered at very much. So before, the last time that Davy was there, when he spent the summer, and they were much younger, they were just like honest friends playing and having fun. But now Davy is noticing that she's enjoying teasing him, which means playing with him, playing with his feelings, or playing with his thoughts, not giving him what he wants. And Davy, he notices that, and he's very curious. Why is she doing this? That's not how, that wasn't our relationship before. The tea table was ready, and our little locker was put out on its old place. But instead of coming to sit by me, she went and bestowed her company upon the grumbling Miss Gummidge. So before, when they would have tea, they would sit next to each other, together, on the same little chair. But this time she wouldn't do it. Instead, she went and sat by the always depressed Miss Gummidge. The grumbling Miss Gummidge. Grumbling is like complaining, like that's grumbling. So Miss Gummidge is always depressed and in a bad mood, and Emily went over there. And on Mr. Peggotty's inquiring why, rumpled her hair all over her face to hide it, and could do nothing but laugh. So Mr. Peggotty said, why aren't you going to sit by Davy? And she got embarrassed, and she put her hair over her face and started laughing. A little puss, is it? Said Mr. Peggotty, patting her with his great hand. A puss is a cat. So I think he's calling her a cat. I'm not sure. Puss could mean a couple of other things. It also means face. But I think here it means cat. A little puss it is. So he's calling her a little cat, said Mr. Peggotty, patting her with his great big hand. So she is, cried Ham. Master Davy bore, so she is. And he sat and chuckled at her for some time in a state of mingled admiration and delight that made his face burning red. So I think what they understand is that Emily has love feelings for Davy, but she's very embarrassed. But Ham and Mr. Peggotty can see it, and they know it, and they're laughing and making fun of her. Little Emily was spoiled by them all, in fact. That means they would give Emily whatever she wanted. They were very nice to her, and they always gave her whatever she wanted. Little Emily was spoiled by them all, in fact, and by no one more than Mr. Peggotty himself, whom she could have coaxed into anything. So Mr. Peggotty was the one who spoiled her the most, who would give her anything that she wanted. And this is saying that Emily could coax anything out of him, meaning she could get anything from him. He would give her anything she wanted. By only going and laying her cheek against his rough whisker. So all she had to do to get whatever she wanted was to lay her cheek against his. And then he would give her whatever she wanted. That was my opinion, at least, when I saw her do it. And I held Mr. Peggotty to be thoroughly in the right. So Davy is saying, well, that's what I observed. That's what I saw. And in my opinion, I would probably do the same thing if she did that to me. That's what he's saying. But she was so affectionate and sweet-natured, and had such a pleasant manner of being both sly and shy at once, that she captivated me more than ever. So he's saying, now I have stronger feelings for Emily than I did before. She was so tender-hearted too. For when, as we sat round the fire after tea, an allusion was made by Mr. Peggotty over his pipe to the loss I had sustained, and the tears stood in her eyes, and she looked at me so kindly across the table that I felt quite thankful to her. So he's saying that she's a very kind person. And when Mr. Peggotty mentioned the death of Davy's mother, Emily started to cry, and she gave him a look. Davy saw a look on her face where he could see that she really felt bad for him, and he was thankful for that. "Ah," said Mr. Peggotty, taking up her curls and running them over his hand like water. Like this, so he's doing this with her hair. "Here's another orphan, you see, sir. And here," said Mr. Peggotty, giving Ham a backhanded knock on the chest. So this is the back of the hand. So Mr. Peggotty does this to Ham, a backhanded knock on the chest. "Is another of 'em, though he don't look much like it." So little Emily is an orphan because these are people who work in the ocean. They're fishermen. And so Emily's family died. The father died in the ocean. It's a very dangerous job, and I don't know what happened to the mother. But Mr. Peggotty takes care of her, just like he takes care of Miss Gummidge, whose family died fishing. And just like Ham, I don't remember Ham's story, but I guess he's an orphan because Mr. Peggotty says, "Here's one orphan, Emily. Here's another orphan, Ham. And here's another orphan, Davy," because now Davy doesn't have any parents. "If I had you for my guardian, Mr. Peggotty," said I, shaking my head, "I don't think I should feel much like it." Oh, well, let's go back and read that again. So Peggotty says, "And here's another orphan," talking about Ham. Ham's a big, strong guy. And then Mr. Peggotty says, "though he don't look it," which means he doesn't look like an orphan. You would never know that he was an orphan. And then Davy says, "If I had you for my guardian, Mr. Peggotty," said I, shaking my head, "I don't think I should feel much like it." Meaning, if Mr. Peggotty were taking care of Davy, he wouldn't feel like an orphan either. Well said, Master Davy Bore," cried Ham, in an ecstasy. "Hurrah! Well said. Nor more you wouldn't. Hor. I don't know what that means. Hor. Here he returned Mr. Peggotty's backhander. So this is the back of the hand, and this is backhanding. When you hit somebody like that, that's a backhand. So Ham did this to Mr. Peggotty. Oh, you can't see that. Okay. Let's see. Where are we? And little Emily got up and kissed Mr. Peggotty. "And how's your friend, sir?" said Mr. Peggotty to me. "Steerforth," said I. "That's the name," cried Mr. Peggotty, turning to Ham. "I knowed it was something in our way." "You said it was Rudderford," observed Ham, laughing. "Well," retorted Mr. Peggotty, "and ye steer with a rudder, don't ye? It ain't fur. It ain't fur off. How is he, sir?" A rudder, Rutherford is a name. So I think he pronounced it Rudderford instead of Rutherford. But a rudder is the thing on the bottom of a boat that steers the boat. Okay, let's see. "He was very well indeed when I came away, Mr. Peggotty." "There's a friend," said Mr. Peggotty, stretching out his pipe. "There's a friend, if you talk of friends. Why, Lord love my heart alive, if it ain't a treat to look at him." So Mr. Peggotty is saying he's a good friend and he's very good looking. He's very handsome. He is very handsome, is he not? Said I, my heart warming with praise. Handsome, cried Mr. Peggotty. He stands up to you like a, why, I don't know what he don't stand up to you like. He's so bold. Yes, that's just his character, said I. He's as brave as a lion, and you can't think how frank he is, Mr. Peggotty. So being frank means that he's very honest. So he's saying, and he's very honest too, Mr. Peggotty. And I do suppose now, said Mr. Peggotty, looking at me through the smoke of his pipe, that in the way of book larning, he'd take the wind out of almost anything. So Mr. Peggotty says he's very smart. Yes, said I, delighted, he knows everything. He is astonishingly clever. There's a friend, murmured Mr. Peggotty, with a grave toss of his head. So murmur is like talk, but it's very low. So he was directly talking to Davy, saying, there's a friend, but now he's kind of going into himself, and he says, man, there's a friend. So the murmur is kind of a soft talking, not a whisper, more of like talking to yourself in a very soft way. Nothing seems to cost him any trouble, said I. He knows a task if he only looks at it. He is the best cricketer you ever saw. He will give you almost as many men as you like at drafts, and beat you easily. So he's very good at games like cricket and drafts. Mr. Peggotty gave his head another toss, as much as to say, of course he will. Okay, a toss is like throw, but here I think it means like that, something like that. He is such a speaker, I pursued, that he can win anybody over. And I don't know what you'd say if you were to hear him sing, Mr. Peggotty. So he's a wonderful speaker. Now, there's a phrasal verb in here. He can win anybody over. To win someone over means to make them like you. So when he says let's read it again and see how they use it. He can win anybody over. He's such a good speaker, I pursued. He could win anybody over. So he's so good at speaking that you want to be his friend. And I don't know what you'd say if you were to hear him sing, and he's also a very good singer. Mr. Peggotty gave his head another toss, as much as to say, I have no doubt of it. So maybe like this. I'm doing it backward, but it should be forward. He's kind of nodding yes, but with one movement. Okay. Then he's such a generous, fine, noble fellow, said I, quite carried away by my favorite theme, that it's hardly possible to give him much praise as he deserves. I'm sure I can never feel thankful enough for the generosity with which he has protected me, so much younger and lower in school than himself. Steerforth was the oldest boy in the school, and Davy was young, and he was in a very bad situation when he first arrived, and Steerforth always protected him. And so Davy's always been grateful for Steerforth's protection. And so in a way, he's kind of in love with Steerforth. I was running on, very fast indeed, when my eyes rested on little Emily's face, which was bent forward over the table, listening with the deepest attention, her breath held, her blue eyes sparkling like jewels, and the color mantling in her cheeks. She looked so extraordinarily earnest and pretty that I stopped in a sort of wonder. So Davy was so amazed by little Emily's beauty. They all observed at the same time, for as I stopped, They laughed and looked at her. So for Davy was busy talking about Steerforth, and then he got distracted by Emily, and it was very obvious from the look on his face. He was kind of in love with Emily, and all of the adults could see it, and they started laughing because it was so obvious. Emily's like me, said Peggotty, and would like to see him. Emily was confused by our all observing her and hung down her head, and her face was covered with blushes. So she was very embarrassed by all of this. Glancing up, presently through her stray curls, so she had curly hair and they were everywhere, and seeing that we were all looking at her still, I'm sure I, for one, could have looked at her for hours. She ran away and kept away till it was nearly bedtime. So that everybody was looking at her, and it embarrassed her, so she ran away and stayed, and she didn't come back to the table. I lay down in the little old bed in the stern of the boat, and the wind came moaning on across the flat as it had done before. But I could not help fancying now that it moaned, moaning as ooh. So that's the sound of the wind. That's the sound of a ghost, but it's also the sound of a wind. The wind was moaning, ooh. That it moaned of those who were gone. You see, he's using it in that way where it means two things. It's the sound of the wind, but it also is the sound of a ghost, of crying, the crying of the dead. That it moaned of those who were gone. So he's hearing the moaning of the dead. And instead of thinking of the sea, that the sea might rise in that night and float the boat away, in the previous chapter, when Davy first came to stay at Yarmouth with Mr. Peggotty, he was amazed because actually they don't live in a house. They live in an old boat. Maybe an old boat that was ruined somehow came onto the beach. So they live right on the ocean in this old boat that Mr. Peggotty made into a house. So that's what he's thinking, that maybe the water will come up really high and take the boat back into the ocean while he's sleeping. I thought of the sea that had risen since I last heard those sounds and drowned my happy home. I recollect as the wind and water began to sound fainter in my ears, putting a short clause into my prayers, petitioning that I might grow up to marry little Emily, and so dropping lovingly asleep. The days passed pretty much as they had passed before, except it was a great exception that little Emily and I seldom wandered on the beach now. She had tasks to learn and needlework to do, and was absent during a great part of each day. But I felt that we should not have had those old wanderings, even if it had been otherwise. So she's very busy now learning things because she's getting older. And that makes Davy sad because he couldn't spend time with her. But he's thinking that even if she hadn't been so busy, they probably wouldn't have spent much time together. Wild and full of childish whims as Emily was, she was more of a little woman than I had supposed. She seemed to have got a great distance away from me, in little more than a year. She liked me, but she laughed at me. She tormented me, and when I went to meet her, stole home another way, and was laughing at the door when I came back, disappointed. So before, Davy's noticing this again, that it was just a little bit more than a year ago when they were playing together and having fun together, and then Davy went away, and now that he's back, they don't have the same relationship. She still likes him, but they don't have this honest friendship now. Now she teases him. She knows that he's going to walk towards the school to meet her when she's walking home, and because she knows that, she takes a different way. So Davy doesn't see her, and when Davy returns home, she laughs at him. He knows that she still likes him, but now he's noticing that she likes him in a different way. The best times were when we sat quietly at work in the doorway, and I sat on the wooden step at her feet, reading to her. It seems to me at this hour that I have never seen such sunlight as on those bright April afternoons, that I have never seen such a sunny little figure as I used to see, sitting in the doorway of the old boat. And I have never beheld such a sky, such a water, such glorified ships sailing away into the golden air. So, because he loves this time that he spends with Emily, all of these things seem so beautiful to him. The sky, the water. He's going to remember all of these things later as the most beautiful sky and the most beautiful water. On the very first evening after our arrival, Mr. Barkis appeared in an exceedingly vacant and awkward condition. Vacant means empty, and awkward means uncomfortable. So Mr. Barkis wasn't reacting. He was just sitting there, empty, that's vacant, and awkward, uncomfortable. With a bundle of oranges tied up in a handkerchief. So remember, we already saw that word handkerchief. It's just a piece of fabric. So he had some oranges in a handkerchief. As he made no allusion of any kind to this property, he was supposed to have left it behind him by accident when he went away, until Ham, running after him to restore it, came back with the information that it was intended for Peggotty. So Mr. Peggotty was in the house with a let's say a bag of oranges, and he looked strange, vacant, no emotion on his face, no thoughts. You don't know what he's thinking. And when he left, he left the oranges there at the home, and he started walking to wherever he was going. And Ham had to take the bag of oranges and run after him and bring it to him. When Ham returned, he said these were for Peggotty, the maid. After that occasion, he appeared every evening at exactly the same hour, and always with a little bundle, to which he never alluded. So he always had these little things. One day it was like a bag of oranges, but every day there was something. But he never talked about it. He never said why he had it or what it was for. And which he regularly put behind the door and left there. These offerings of affection were of a most various and eccentric description. Among them I remember a double set of pig's trotters. Those are pig's feet. So one time he had a bundle of oranges, a bag of oranges, and one time it was pig's trotters, pig's feet. A huge pin cushion, half a bushel or so of apples. A pair of jet earrings, some Spanish onions, a box of dominoes. Dominoes are a game, onions, earrings, apples, and a leg of pickled pork. Mr. Barkis's wooing, as I remember it, was altogether of a peculiar kind. He would seldom say anything, but would sit by the fire in much the same attitude. Oh wait, are we talking about Mr. Barkis? Oh, all this time we were talking about Mr. Barkis. So Mr. Barkis is the one coming and bringing these presents and these gifts, and they're for Peggotty. Because he's wooing her. To woo someone is to show them that you're in love with them and you want to marry them. So every night he's coming with a bag of presents for Peggotty. I was wondering, that didn't make sense to me. Okay. So Mr. Barkis is wooing. That's his attempt to make Peggotty feel love for him so that she'll want to marry him. As I remember, it was altogether of a peculiar kind. So him doing this was very strange. He very seldom said anything. So he would come to the home with a present, but he wouldn't say anything because he never talks. But would sit by the fire in much the same attitude as he sat in his cart. So, he drives a cart and he never talks. He just takes people where they need to go. And this is the same thing. He goes to the house to make Peggotty his wife, but he doesn't say anything. He just comes and sits by the fire and stare heavily at Peggotty, who was opposite. So Peggotty, he would sit by the fire and Peggotty would sit opposite, and he would just look at her. That's kind of creepy. One night, being, as I suppose, inspired by love, he made a dart at a big wax candle she kept for her thread. So she's sewing something. And it says he made a dart at a candle, which I think we'll see in a minute, but I think it means he reached for it very quickly. And put it in his waistcoat pocket and carried it off. After that, his great delight was to produce it when it was wanted, sticking it to the lining of his pocket in a partially melted state, and pocket it again when it was done with. He seemed to enjoy himself very much, and not feel at all called upon to talk, even when he took Peggotty out for. So I think what they're saying, because he doesn't like to talk, he doesn't like to make conversation. So he took the candle that Peggotty was using so that she could sew, and he took it out so that he could give her light when she wanted it. So if she needed it for something, she would ask him for the candle, and he would be very happy to take it out and light it for her and do her that favor. And that was his way of showing affection. I guess that's what I'm interpreting here. It's very weird. Even when he took Peggotty out for a walk on the flats, he had no uneasiness on that head, I believe, contenting himself with now and then asking her if she was pretty comfortable. And I remember that sometimes after he was gone, Peggotty would throw her apron over her face and laugh. So she was embarrassed by the whole thing, and she would wear her apron, and when she got embarrassed, she would do this and start laughing. Okay, for half an hour, indeed. We were all more or less amused, except that miserable Mrs. Gummidge, whose courtship would appear to have been an exactly parallel nature. She was so continually reminded by these transactions of the old one. So Mrs. Gummidge wasn't having fun with all this. She didn't like it. She didn't have fun with anything, though, because she was always in a bad mood. At length, when the term of my visit was nearly expired, it was given out that Peggotty and Mr. Barkis were going to make a day's holiday together, and that little Emily and I were to accompany them. So Peggotty and Mr. Barkis and Emily and Davy were all going on a little day trip together. I had but a broken sleep the night before, in anticipation of the pleasure of a whole day with Emily. We were all astir betimes in the morning. And while we were yet at breakfast, Mr. Barkis appeared in the distance, driving a chaise cart towards the object of his affection. So we all learned in the last chapter that a chaise cart is kind of more of a fancy cart. And I think Mr. Barkis drives a very plain cart, but the chaise cart is very fancy. So Mr. Barkis comes while they're having breakfast. Peggotty was dressed, as usual, in her neat and quiet mourning. So Peggotty is still wearing black, just like a plain black dress because she's still feeling sad about Davy's mother's death. But Mr. Barkis bloomed in a new blue coat, of which the tailor had given him such good measure that the cuffs would have rendered gloves unnecessary in the coldest weather, while the collar was so high that it pushed his hair up on end on the top of his head. His bright buttons, too, were of the largest size, rendered complete by drab pantaloons and a buff waistcoat. I thought Mr. Barkis a phenomenon of respectability. So Mr. Barkis looked very nice. It seems like today's the day that they're getting married. When we were all in a bustle outside the door, I found that Mr. Peggotty was prepared with an old shoe, which was to be thrown after us for good luck, and which he offered to Mrs. Gummidge for that purpose. So I guess there must be some tradition of throwing an old shoe at somebody when they get married for good luck. And he gave it to Mrs. Gummidge so that she could do it. And she said, "No, it had better be done by somebody else, Dan'l," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I'm a lone, lorn creature myself, and everything that reminds me of creatures that ain't lone and lorn goes contrary with me." So she's saying, no, I don't want to throw it because I'm a miserable person and I hate seeing people happy. That's really what she's saying. He says, "Come, old gal," cried Mr. Peggotty, "take and heave it. Take it and throw it." "No, Daniel," returned Mrs. Gummidge, whimpering and shaking her head. "If I felt less, I could do more. You don't feel like me, Daniel. Things don't go contrary with you, nor with them. You had better do it yourself." So she's saying, no, I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm a miserable person. But here, Peggotty, who had been going about from one to another in a hurried way, kissing everyone, calling out from the cart, in which we were all by this time, Emily and I, on two little chairs side by side, that Mrs. Gummidge must do it. So Mrs. Gummidge did it, and I am sorry to relate, cast a damp upon the festive character of our departure. So Mrs. Gummidge did throw the shoe for good luck, but it really just ruined everything. It didn't make it nice. It wasn't fun. Let me finish. By immediately bursting into tears and sinking subdued into the arms of Ham, with a declaration that she knowed she was a burden and had better be carried out to the house at once, which I really thought was a sensible idea that Ham might have acted on. So she said, "Okay, fine," and she threw the shoe, and then she started crying and saying how horrible she is, and they shouldn't let her live there anymore, and Davy thought that was a good idea. Maybe they shouldn't let her live there anymore. Anyway, we went, however, on our holiday excursion, and the first thing that we did was to stop at a church, where Mr. Barkis tied the horse to some rails, and he went in with Peggotty, leaving little Emily and me alone in the chaise. I took that occasion to put my arm around Emily's waist. So that's this part of the body down here. And propose that as I was going away so very soon, we should determine to be very affectionate to one another and very happy all day. Little Emily consenting and allowing me to kiss her, I became desperate, informing her, I recollect, that I never could love another, and that I was prepared to shed the blood of anyone who should aspire to her affection. So, since Davy's been back to Yarmouth, Emily hasn't been very nice to him. She's been teasing him, making fun of him, making him feel bad. And he's saying, "This is such a nice day. Can't we just be really nice to each other today?" And she said, "Okay." And then he gave her a kiss. And then he was remembering how he felt that day, that he would kill someone if they ever tried to get her love, because he was in love with her. How merry little Emily made herself about it, with what demure assumption of being immensely older and wiser than I. The fairy, the fairy little woman said I was a silly boy, and then laughed so charmingly that I forgot the pain of being called by that disparaging name and the pleasure of looking at her. So she was still laughing at him, even after she promised to be nice. Mr. Barkis and Peggotty were a good while in the church, but came out at last. And then we drove away into the country. As we were going along, Mr. Barkis turned to me and said with a wink, that's a wink, and said with a wink, by the by, I should hardly have thought before that he could wink. So Mr. Barkis never shows emotion. He never talks. He just drives his horse. And so that was very surprising that he looked over at Davy and gave him a wink. What name was I wrote up in the cart? Clara Peggotty, I answered. The very first time Mr. Barkis took Davy to town to go to school, they were driving away, and Barkis said, what's that woman's name? And Davy said, it's Peggotty, Clara Peggotty. And Mr. Barkis wrote Clara Peggotty on the side of his cart because he fell in love with her. So now he's remembering that time a year and a half ago when he did that. He's saying, what's that name I wrote in the cart? And Davy remembers because he said, why did he write Peggotty's name on the cart? Clara Peggotty, I answered. What name would it be as I should write upon it now, if there was a tilt here? So he's saying, if I had a pen, what name would I write now? And Davy answered, Clara Peggotty again, I suggested. Clara Peggotty Barkis, he returned, and burst into a roar of laughter that shook the chaise. So he said, Clara Peggotty Barkis, and then he laughed. And it was such a big laugh, it shook the cart. In a word, they were married and had gone into the church for no other purpose. Peggotty was resolved that it should be quietly done, and the clerk had given her away, and there had been no witness of the ceremony. She was a little confused when Mr. Barkis made this abrupt announcement of their union, and could not hug me enough in token of her unimpaired affection. But she soon became herself again, and said she was very glad it was over. We drove to a little inn in a by-road, where we were expected, and where we had a very comfortable dinner, and passed a day with great satisfaction. If Peggotty had been married every day for the last 10 years, she could hardly have been more at her ease about it. It made no sort of difference in her. She was just the same as ever, and went out for a stroll with little Emily and me before tea. So Davy's a little bit surprised because Peggotty's just acting normal. She just got married, but she's just acting like nothing ever happened. And Mr. Barkis is very happy and laughing. While Mr. Barkis philosophically smoked his pipe and enjoyed himself, I suppose, with the contemplation of his happiness. If so, it sharpened his appetite, for I distinctly called to mind that although he had eaten a good deal of pork and greens at dinner, and had finished off with a fowl or two, he was obliged to have a cold-boiled bacon for tea. That sounds disgusting, cold-boiled bacon. And disposed of a large quantity without any emotion. So Mr. Barkis is eating quite a bit of food. He had, what did he eat? He ate a lot of pork and greens for dinner, so green vegetables. And he finished off with a fowl or two. A fowl is a bird. So he ate one or two birds, some kind of bird. And he was obliged to have cold-boiled bacon for tea. And for tea, he had cold-boiled bacon and disposed of a large quantity without any emotion. So he just ate, and you couldn't even see if he enjoyed it. He just was eating. I've often thought since what an odd, innocent, out-of-the-way kind of wedding it must have been. We got into the chaise again after dark, and drove cozily back, looking up at the stars and talking about them. I was their chief exponent and opened Mr. Barkis's mind to an amazing extent. I told him all I knew, but he would have believed anything I might have taken into my head to impart to him, for he had a profound veneration for my abilities, and informed his wife in my hearing on that very occasion that I was a young Rosehoose. I don't know who that is, by which I think he meant prodigy. Okay, Davy doesn't know either. But so they're going back home, and it's nighttime, and the stars are out. And Davy happens to know something about the stars, so he's telling everybody what he sees in the sky. And Mr. Barkis is actually somebody who doesn't talk or doesn't seem to think much, is actually very interested in what Davy is saying. And Davy says, I could have lied. I could have told them anything, and he would have believed it because he thinks I'm like the smartest person in the world. And he even heard him tell Peggotty that he thinks that I'm the smartest person in the world. When we had exhausted the subject of the stars, or rather, when I had exhausted the mental faculties of Mr. Barkis, little Emily and I made a cloak of an old wrapper and sat under it for the rest of the journey. So eventually, Davy had no more information to give about the stars, and anyway, Mr. Barkis was getting very bored. So I guess he got close with Emily, and they covered themselves with something. It sounds like a piece of paper to keep them warm, an old wrapper. I hope that's not paper. It could be paper. I don't know what a wrapper is 180 years ago. Maybe it's like a wrap, like a blanket. But to me, a wrapper is a piece of paper. Oh, how I loved her! What happiness, I thought, if we were married, and we were going anywhere to live among the trees and in the fields, never growing older, never growing wiser, children ever rambling hand in hand through sunshine and among flowery meadows, laying down our heads on moss at night, in a sweet sleep of purity and peace, and buried by the birds when we were dead. Some such picture, with no real world in it, bright with the light of our innocence, and vague as the stars as far off, was in my mind all the way. I'm glad to think that there were two such guileless hearts as Peggotty's marriage, as little Emily's and mine. I'm glad to think the Loves and Graces took such airy forms in its homely procession. Well, we came to the old boat again, and in good time at night, and there Mr. and Mrs. Barkis bade us goodbye. So Peggotty, who is now Mrs. Barkis, and Mr. Barkis said goodbye to them and drove away, snugly to their own home. Snug means comfortable, nice and warm and comfortable. So they drove away nice and warm and comfortable to their own home. I felt then, for the first time, that I had lost Peggotty. I should have gone to bed with a sore heart, so pain in my heart, under any other roof but that which sheltered little Emily's head. So if he had been anywhere else, he would have been feeling a lot of pain. But because he was there with Emily, he didn't feel that pain. But he knew Peggotty was now gone. Mr. Peggotty and Ham knew what was in my thoughts as well as I did, and were ready with some supper and their hospitable faces to drive it away. So Mr. Peggotty and Ham knew that when Davy would come home, he would be very sad because he lost Peggotty forever. So they were ready with a lot of food and a lot of activities to keep him distracted. Little Emily came and sat beside me on the locker for the only time in all that visit, and it was altogether a wonderful close to a wonderful day. It was a night tide, and soon after we went to bed, Mr. Peggotty and Ham went out to fish. I felt very brave at being left alone in the solitary house, the protector of Emily and Mrs. Gummidge. and only wished that a lion or a serpent or any ill-disposed monster would make an attack upon us, that I might destroy him and cover myself with glory. So uh, Ham and Mr. Peggotty went out fishing in the middle of the night. So they left Davy home alone with Emily and Mrs. Gummidge. And now he's feeling very brave and powerful. And he's fantasizing about some monster coming to attack so he can kill the monster and be the hero. But as nothing of the sort happened to be walking about on Yarmouth Flats that night, I provided the best substitute I could by dreaming of dragons until morning. So nothing like that happened. So he just dreamt about that all night. With morning came Peggotty, who called to me, as usual, under my window, as if Mr. Barkis the carrier had been from first to last a dream too. A dream too. So Peggotty arrived early in the morning like nothing ever happened, like she wasn't married. Like nothing changed. After breakfast, she took me to her own home, and a beautiful little home it was. Of all the movables in it, I must have been impressed by a certain old bureau of some dark wood in the parlor. The tile-floored kitchen was the general sitting room, and with a retreating top which opened, let down, and became a desk. Well, just in case you don't know what a bureau is, let's just look at that for a minute. A bureau is, let me find a good picture of one here. You could say a bureau is something like this. Let me show you this picture. Oh, wait a minute. That's a bureau. I mean, some people would call that a secretary, or a secrétaire, if you want to be French about it. but you could call it a bureau also. So Davy goes to Peggotty's new home, and the most impressive piece of furniture is this bureau. And you could see that the bureau, I should have showed you that. It could be a desk. You can make it a desk. Let's read that again. I must have been impressed by a certain old bureau of some dark wood in the parlor. The tile-floored kitchen was the general sitting room, with a retreating top. Oh, it's the kind of bureau that curves like this and opens up. And became a desk, within which was a large quarto edition of Fox's Book of Martyrs. This precious volume, of which I do not recollect one word, I immediately discovered and immediately applied myself to, and never visited the house, and I never visited the house afterwards, but I kneeled on the chair, opened the casket where the gem was enshrined, spread my arms over the desk, and fell to devouring the book afresh. I was chiefly edified, I'm afraid, by the pictures, which were numerous, and represented all kinds of dismal horrors. But the martyrs and Peggotty's house have been inseparable in my mind ever since, and are now. So Mr. Barkis had this book in the secretary, or in the bureau, that Davy discovered, and it was a book about martyrs. A martyr is a person who dies for a belief. So in this situation, it's probably for a religious belief. So this is a book about famous religious martyrs, people who died for their religion or for their religious beliefs. And the thing that fascinated Davy were the pictures. So these were all a bunch of pictures of people being murdered. And Davy was very interested in that, and he always went and looked at it. Okay, let's see. And now every time he thinks of that period in his life, he remembers two things about that house, Peggotty and that book. So he always associates that house with that book, which he loved to look at. I took leave of Mr. Peggotty and Ham and Mrs. Gummidge and little Emily that day, and passed the night at Peggotty's. When you say take leave of, it's not something that's so common in modern English, but that means say goodbye, like say goodbye officially. So, because he was spending the night at Peggotty's, he very formally said goodbye to Mr. Peggotty and Ham and Emily and Mrs. Gummidge. Goodbye, thank you very much for having me. Like almost asking permission to go. That's what taking leave is. So I took leave of Mr. Peggotty and Ham and Mrs. Gummidge and little Emily that day, and passed the night at Peggotty's in a little room in the roof, with the crocodile book on a shelf by the bed's head. When Davy was a little boy, well, he's still a little boy, but when he was much younger, he used to sit next to Peggotty, and she would read him this book about crocodiles. So that's a very warm memory that they both have. And she still has the book, and she put it in Davy's room. Which was to, let me reread that again. I'll read the whole paragraph again. I took leave of Mr. Peggotty and Ham and Mrs. Gummidge and little Emily that day, and passed the night at Peggotty's in a little room in the roof, with the crocodile book on the shelf by the bed's head, which was always to be mine. So that was Davy's room. Peggotty gave it to him. Peggotty said, and should always be kept for me in exactly the same way. So Peggotty said, this is your room forever, and I will never change it. I'll never touch anything in here. It's your room. It will stay this way. Young or old, Davy dear, as long as I'm alive and have this house over my head, said Peggotty, you shall find it as I expected you were here directly minute. I shall keep it every day as I used to keep your old little room, my darling. And if you was to go to China, you might think of it as being kept just the same. All the same, you were away. So that's Peggotty saying, I'll never change anything. This is always your room. It will stay just this way, waiting for you whenever you want it. I felt the truth and constancy of my dear old nurse with all my heart, and I thanked her as well as I could. That was not very well, for she spoke to me thus, with her arms round my neck, in the morning, and I was going home in the morning. And I went home in the morning, with herself and Mr. Barkis in the cart. So Davy had to leave and go back home to the Murdstones, who hate him. They left me at the gate, not easily or lightly, and it was a strange sight to me to see the cart go on, taking Peggotty away, and leaving me under the old elm trees, looking at the house, in which there was no face to look on mine with love or liking anymore. So he's looking at this house where he grew up, but he's not welcome there anymore. He has to go back there, but he's not welcome there. He doesn't feel any more love coming from that house. And now I fell into a state of neglect, which I cannot look back upon without compassion. I fell at once into a solitary condition, apart from all friendly notice, apart from society of all other boys my own age, apart from all companionship, but my own spiritless thoughts, which seems to cast its gloom upon this paper as I write. What would I have given to have been sent to the hardest school that was ever kept, to have been taught something, anyhow, anywhere? No such hope dawned upon me. They disliked me. They sullenly, sternly, steadily overlooked me. I looked Mr. Murdstone's means. I think Mr. Murdstone's means were straitened at about this time. But it's a little to the purpose. He could not bear me. And in putting me from him, he tried, as I believe, to put away the notion that I had any claim upon him, and succeeded. Well, this is a pretty complicated paragraph, even for a native speaker. So let's go through it a little bit more closely, see what it means. So he starts off by saying, "What would I have given to be sent to the hardest school that was ever kept?" Now remember, Davy went to Salem House, and there they used to hit him and beat him. And now he's thinking, gosh, I wish I was at that school again. That's how horrible being home was. To have been taught something, because at least he would be learning. Anyhow, anywhere, no such hope dawned upon me. So there was no hope of that. He wasn't going back to school. They disliked me, and they sullenly, sternly, steadily overlooked me. To overlook something, it means like it's literally to look over. It's like ignoring something. You don't see it, you look past it. So here's Davy. This is overlooking something. It means it's right in front of you, but you don't see it. I think Mr. Murdstone's means were straightened at about that time. Okay, means here means how much money you have, how you live. So when he says, I think Mr. Murdstone's means were straightened at about that time, that probably means because the mother died, Mr. Murdstone inherited the house and all of the valuables in the house. So now he's got a lot of money to live with, or to live off of, that he didn't have before because Davy's mother died. So I think Mr. Murdstone's means were straightened, we're finished, we're okay now at about this time. But it is little to the purpose. He could not bear me. So it doesn't matter that Mr. Murdstone had a lot of money now, because he hated Davy. So who cares? It doesn't matter. He could not bear me. And in putting me from him, he tried. So he always avoided Davy. As I believe, to put away the notion that I had any claim upon him, and succeeded. So when Davy returned to the house, Mr. Murdstone did everything to ignore him, because he wanted to avoid the situation where Davy... Oh, this is hard to explain, because Mr. Murdstone is responsible for Davy, because he was married to his mother. And now Mr. Murdstone is the only relation that he has. And he has a responsibility to send him to school or find something for him to do or feed him. I think legally he does. But Mr. Murdstone is avoiding him because he doesn't want Davy to make that connection. He doesn't want Davy to remind him that he's supposed to take care of him. He's not going to take care of him. And Davy knows it. That's pretty much what that paragraph means. It's written in a difficult way, I think. I was not actively ill-used. That means they didn't hurt me. They didn't abuse me. They didn't hit me or anything like that. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't starved. They gave me food. But the wrong that was done to me had no intervals of relenting, and was done in a systematic, passionless manner, day after day, week after week, month after month. I was coldly neglected. They just ignored me. They didn't talk to me. They didn't do anything. They pretended like I didn't exist. I wonder sometimes, when I think of it, what they would have done if I had been taken with an illness, whether I should have lain down in my lonely room and languished through it in my usual solitary way, or whether anybody would have helped me out. So Davy's wondering, what if I got sick? Would they call a doctor? Would they take care of me? Or would I just go to my room and die? When Mr. and Mrs. Murdstone were at home, I took my meals with them. In their absence, I ate and drank by myself. At all times, I lounged about in the house and the neighborhood, quite disregarded. So nobody thought about him. He was neglected, ignored, and nobody thought or cared about him, except that they were jealous of my making any friends, thinking perhaps that if I did, I might complain to someone. For this reason, Mr. Chillip often asked me to go and see him. He was a widower, having some years before that lost his little small, light-haired wife, whom I can just remember connecting in my own thoughts with a pale tortoise-shell cat. So they didn't like him making friends. They didn't want him making friends because they were afraid that he would tell people how they were neglecting him. And Mr. Chillip, who I think is a neighbor, used to invite, he's an older man, used to invite Davy to come and visit him because he was all alone. He was a widower. That means that his wife died. And so he was all alone. But it was seldom that I enjoyed the happiness of passing an afternoon in his closet of surgery, reading some book that was new to me, with the smell of the whole pharmacopoeia coming up my nose, or pounding something in a mortar under his mild direction. So I guess Mr. Chillip is a doctor. And so Davy used to spend the time reading medical books or helping him make medicines. For the same reason, added no doubt to the old dislike of her, I was seldom allowed to visit Peggotty. Faithful to her promise, she either came to see me or met me somewhere near, once every week, and never empty-handed. But many and bitter were the disappointments I had in being refused permission to pay a visit to her at her house. So Peggotty kept her promise, and she continued every week to come and visit Davy, and she brought him gifts and presents. And they didn't like that. The Murdstons didn't like that. And they definitely would not let him go and visit her in Yarmouth. Some few times, however, at long intervals, I was allowed to go there. So sometimes they did let him go to Yarmouth. And I found out that Mr. Barkis was something of a miser. A miser is a person who doesn't like to spend money. So he's very cheap. He doesn't like to spend money. Or, as Peggotty dutifully expressed it, a little near. So that's how Peggotty used to call it. He's a little near. That means he's cheap. He doesn't like to spend money. And kept a heap of money in a box under his bed, which he pretended was only full of coats and trousers. So actually, Mr. Barkis had an enormous amount of money, but he kept it in a chest under his bed, and he told everybody that was a chest of clothes. In this coffer, his riches hid themselves with such a tenacious modesty that the smallest installments could only be tempted out by artifice, so that Peggotty had to prepare a long and elaborate scheme, a very gunpowder plot for every Saturday's expenses. So it was difficult for Peggotty to go shopping for the household to buy food and things like that. And she had to come up with plans to convince Mr. Barkis to give her money. Even a little bit, even just a little bit of money for the house, for food and for things like that. I now approach a period of my life which I can never lose the remembrance of. While I remember anything, and the recollection of which has often, without my invocation, come before me like a ghost and haunted happier times. So now Davy's preparing us for a horrible time. He's saying, I now approach a period of my life which I can never forget while I remember anything. And remembering this without my invocation, without me thinking about it, sometimes it just appears in my head. And it ruins even the happiest times of my life. So, because he's writing this as an adult, and he's remembering this period when he was a child, and he's saying, sometimes when I'm having a great time, a happy time, I suddenly accidentally remember this period of my life, and it ruins my happy time. I had been out one day, loitering somewhere. Loitering means standing around and doing nothing. Hanging out is what loitering. If this were written now, it would be, I had been out hanging out. somewhere in the listless, meditative manner that my way of life engendered. When turning the corner of a lane near our house, I came upon Mr. Murdstone walking with a gentleman. I was confused, and was going by them, when the gentleman cried, "What, Brooks?" "No, sir, David Copperfield," I said. "Don't tell me you're Brooks," said the gentleman. "You're Brooks of Sheffield, that's your name." At these words I observed the gentleman more attentive, his laugh coming to my remembrance too. I knew him to be Mr. Quinion, whom I had gone over to Lowestoft with Mr. Murdstone to see before. Well, that's a weirdly worded sentence. Let me read that again. I knew him to be Mr. Quinion, whom I had gone over to Lowestoft with Mr. Murdstone to see before. It is no matter, I need not recall then. And how do you? So he's remembering Mr. Quinion. I just barely remember this from maybe chapter 3 or chapter 4, when Davy's mother first got married to Mr. Murdstone. Mr. Murdstone took Davy with him on some meeting, and Mr. Quinion was there. I don't remember the purpose of it or why, but I remember that. So Mr. Murdstone and Mr. Quinion are people, they know each other, and Davy met him a long time ago. He had put his hand on my shoulder and turned me about to walk with them. I did not know what to reply, and glanced dubiously at Mr. Murdstone. Dubiously means like with doubt. So he was looking at Mr. Murdstone like, what's going on? He is at home at present, said the latter. He is not being educated anywhere. I don't know what to do with him. He's a difficult subject. That old double look was on me for a moment, and then his eyes darkened with a frown, as it turned in its aversion elsewhere. So he was looking at Davy, and then aversion means like kind of hatred. So he was looking at Davy, and then his face turned to hatred, like, and then he turned away. Said Mr. Quinion, looking at us both, I thought. Fine weather. Silence ensued, and I was considering how I could best disengage my shoulder from his hand. So he had his, I don't know if it's Mr. Murdstone or Mr. Quinion has his hand on Davy's shoulder, and Davy's thinking, how can I get away from this man? When he said, I suppose you're a pretty sharp fellow still, eh, Brooks? Aye, he's sharp enough, said Mr. Murdstone impatiently. You had better let him go. He will not thank you for troubling him. On this hint, Mr. Quinion released me, and I made the best of my way home, looking back as I turned into the front garden. I saw Mr. Murdstone leaning against the wicket of the churchyard, and Mr. Quinion talking to him. They were both looking after me, and I felt that they were speaking of me. So Davy, when he finally had permission to leave, went home. So he ran to the house. But when he got to the entrance of the house, he looked back, and he could see them talking. And he didn't know what they were talking about because they were far away. But he had a sense or an intuition that they were talking about him. Mr. Quinion lay at our house that night. After breakfast the next morning, I had put my chair away and was going out of the room when Mr. Murdstone called me back. He then gravely repaired to another table, where his sister sat herself at her desk. Mr. Quinion, with his hands in his pockets, stood looking out the window, and I stood looking at them all. David, said Mr. Murdstone, to the young, this is a world for action, not for moping and droning in. So moping is feeling sorry for yourself. And so Mr. Murdstone is saying, Davy, For the young people, this is a world of action. You should be doing things, not sitting here feeling sorry for yourself, not feeling bad. And his sister added, as you do, meaning as Davy does. Jane Murdstone, leave it to me, if you please, I say. David, to the young, this is a world for action, and not for moping and droning in. It is especially so for a young boy of your disposition. Disposition kind of means like personality. Well, Davy has a good personality, but the Murdstones think that he's horrible. So they're saying especially somebody like you with a horrible attitude, a horrible personality, which requires a great deal of correcting. So they're saying you have to fix your horrible attitude. A great deal of correcting, and to which no greater service can be done than to force it to conform to the ways of the working world, and to bend it and break it. So they're saying you have a horrible attitude, a horrible personality, and the best way to fix this is if you are working. For stubbornness won't do here, his sister said. What it wants is to be crushed. And crushed it must be, shall be, too. So the sister is saying, and you're stubborn, and we don't like that here. So we have to destroy that. He gave her a look, half in remonstrance and half in approval. So she interrupted again, and he didn't like that. But he also agreed with her. That's what it means. I suppose you know, David, that I'm not rich. At any rate, you know it now. You've received some considerable education already. Education is costly. Even if it were not, and I could afford it, I am of opinion that it would not be at all advantageous to you to keep at school, to be kept at school. What is before you is a fight with the world, and the sooner you begin, the better. I think it occurred to me that I had already begun it in my poor way, but it occurs to me now, whether or no, you have heard the counting house? You have heard the counting house mentioned sometimes, said Mr. Murdstone. The counting house, said the counting house, sir, I repeated, of Murdstone. Of Murdstone and Grimby, in the wine trade, he replied. I suppose I looked uncertain, for he went on hastily. You have heard of the counting house mentioned, or the business, or the cellars, or the wharf, or something about it? I think I've heard that business mentioned, sir, I said, remembering what I vaguely knew of his and his sister's resources, but I don't know when. It does not matter when, he returned. Mr. Quinion manages that business. I glanced at the latter deferentially as he stood looking out the window. Mr. Quinion suggests that it gives employment to some other boys, and that he sees no reason why it shouldn't, on the same terms, give employment to you. So Mr. Murdstone has invested in this wine business, and Mr. Quinion is the manager, and they're saying, Davy, now you have to go to this place, this factory, and you have to work there to earn money. We can't support you anymore. He, having, Mr. Quinion observed in a low and half turning round, no other prospect, Mr. Murdstone. And Mr. Quinion is saying he can't do anything else. He must go. So that doesn't sound like a good job. If the reason that you go is because there's nothing else for you to do, that's usually a bad sign. Mr. Murdstone, with an impatient, even an angry gesture, resumed without noticing what he said. Those terms are that you will earn enough for yourself to provide for your eating and drinking and pocket money. Your lodging, which I have arranged for you, will be paid by me. So will your washing. which will be kept down to my estimate, said his sister. Your clothes will be looked after for you, too, said Mr. Murdstone, as you will not be able yet a while to get them for yourself. So you're now going to London, David, with Mr. Quinion, to begin the world on your own account. So they're saying, we'll pay for you, I'm getting tired. I think we're getting close to the end of we're getting very close to the end. They're saying, we will pay for your place to stay. We will pay someone to give you a room. We'll pay for your room. But the money that you earn, you're going to have to use for your food and for your drink and for anything else. But we will pay for your room and your clothes. In short, you are provided for. That's what being provided for means. So the beginning of the chapter, the title was, I'm neglected and I am provided for, which means I'm ignored and I'm treated badly, but they're also taking care of me. And this is the provision they're going to pay for his room. In short, you're provided for, observed his sister, and will please to do your duty. So this is important. They have to give him something because they have a responsibility towards him, but they're giving him the absolute minimum so that people won't think or people won't talk about them. And so she's making that clear. She's saying, you are provided for. Don't you ever say that we didn't provide for you. Don't ruin our reputation. Now you do your duty. So, and his duty is to listen to them and do as they say, which means go to London and work in this horrible place. Though I quite understood that the purpose of this announcement was to get rid of me, I have no distinct remembrance whether it pleased or frightened me. My impression is that I was in a state of confusion about it, and oscillating between the 2 points, touched neither. Nor had I much time for the clearing of my thoughts, as Mr. Quinion was to go upon the morrow. So they were leaving the next day, and Davy didn't even have time to think about what was happening. Behold me on the morrow, in a much worn little white hat, with a black crape round it for my mother, a black jacket, and a pair of hard, stiff corduroy trousers, which Miss Murdstone considered the best armor for the legs in that fight with the world, which was now to come off. So he's just describing how he looked the day that he left that morning. This behold me kind of means look at me. Behold me so attired, with my little worldly all before me in a small trunk. Oh, I think that's a misprint. I think it should be with my little world. And with my little world all before me in a small trunk, sitting, a lone, lorn child. And Mrs. Gummidge might have said, in the post-chaise that was carrying Mr. Quinion to the London coach at Yarmouth. See how our house and church are lessening in the distance. So now he's remembering how the house was looking smaller and smaller as they were going towards Yarmouth in order to go to London. How the grave beneath the tree is blotted out by intervening objects. How the spire points upward from my old playground no more, and the sky is empty. All right, well, that is the end of chapter 10 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Next maybe tomorrow, we will do chapter 11. I begin life on my own account and don't like it. So we'll do that one tomorrow. Thank you for sticking around and watching the whole chapter, and I will see you next time with Chapter 11. I begin my life on my own account and don't like it. Goodbye.